Through continued attacks on American merchant vessels, as well as the provocative Zimmermann Note, Germany left America no other choice but to enter the war in 1917. But President Wilson faced a deeply divided country concerning their support for any long war effort. In this lecture, we will consider how Wilson crafted his war message through his 14 points. We will then look at how America mobilized both politically and economically to support the war effort in Europe. In doing this, we will consider the contributions of women and the adoption of the 19th Amendment. And lastly, we will look at how the United States government took unprecedented measures to control the economy and curb dissent during the war years. For more than a century, the United States had prided itself on isolationism from the old world and its politics. President Wilson needed to instill a burning idealism in order to get Americans aroused to the war task. To win over the hearts and minds of Americans, President Wilson crafted an argument that aimed at two important goals. First, that the war would make the world safe for democracy, and second, that this would be a war to end all wars. Wilson contrasted the selfish war aims of European countries with United States altruism. The United States was not fighting for profit or territorial conquest. Instead, it would be fighting for an international order in which democracy could flourish without fear of autocratic or militaristic gains. Finally, Wilson believed that the United States could genuinely be a world model. The end result of this early effort was that he persuaded Americans to embark on this unprecedented crusade. It's very unlikely that any other politician could have united the fractured country the way that Wilson did so quickly. Additionally, Wilson was soon recognized as a moral leader of not just the United States, but of the Allied cause in general. Most famously, Wilson gave a speech to Congress on January 8, 1918, where he outlined the 14 points of the war's objectives. These points would not just become America's position, but the objectives of World War I and the Allied powers in general. The first proposed to abolish secret treaties. This would have appeased liberals everywhere who were tired of seeing autocratic leaders make decisions secretly and for what appeared to be personal gain. Second, it would have addressed the freedom of the seas. Even the United States was frustrated by its own allies and their control over the Atlantic sea trade, as demonstrated earlier when Britain seized American ships and forced them into their own ports, despite the fact that America had balanced trade with both Britain and Germany. Next, it promised to remove economic barriers and create an international system of free trade. This had been a goal for liberal internationalists everywhere. The 14 points also championed a reduction of armaments. This would have been gratifying to both taxpayers as well as isolationists and pacifists. In the post-war New World Order, countries would readjust their colonial claims. This would be in the best interest of both native people and colonizers, and aimed to reassure anti-imperialists. The hope was to instill self-determination to oppressed minority groups, as well as to reduce the expense of defending and shaping colonial claims. The capstone to the 14 points, number 14 itself, to create collective security and world peace. This body foreshadowed the creation of the League of Nations and ultimately the United Nations. Wilson hoped it would guarantee political independence and territorial integrity for all countries, both large and small. Of course, when you try to appease everyone, you satisfy no one. And some of the Allied leaders were resistant to the idea that they would have to give up territorial gains or the opportunity to punish their enemy. Furthermore, Wilson's rivals at home mocked the 14 points as being lofty and morally superior. Declaring war and laying the principles in which the country would fight is one thing, but being prepared for war is entirely different. The United States economy initially was not geared for a prolonged war in Europe. Wilson's belatedly backed mild preparedness measures began in 1915 through shipbuilding programs and beefing up America's military, which had only previously had 100,000 regular soldiers, ranking it 15th in the world. Ignorance about how to be prepared was also a major stumbling block. Nobody knew exactly how much steel or explosive powder the United States was going to need because no one knew for sure how long the war was going to last. Furthermore, traditional fears about big government and political takeover of private industry hamstrung efforts to centralize the economy from Washington, D.C. Through most of the war years, President Wilson would be dependent on private enterprise voluntarily complying with requests as opposed to issuing directives and forcing state mandates. For these reasons, America would not be the arsenal of democracy that it was during World War II. Most heavy equipment and munitions used by the United States would be produced by its allies, Britain and France. U.S. businesses' desire for laissez-faire capitalism and for weak central government meant that the United States would not be able to participate in any major plans for reconstructing Europe once the war was over. However, there was some government control and oversight over industry in the last year of the war. By March 1918, President Wilson had established the War Industries Board under the directorship of Bernard Baruch. Wilson's administration also took over the nation's railroads following a horrible traffic problems in late 1917. The government would pay owners of the railroad rent and spent more than $500 million to improve the tracks and equipment that were privately owned. Furthermore, the Wilson administration created the Food Administration headed by future President Herbert Hoover. Like the War Industries Board, Hoover preferred to rely on voluntary compliance rather than formal laws and federal directives. He deliberately rejected issuing ration cards to Americans, a practice that was used throughout Europe. Instead, federal agencies used propaganda, such as posters, billboards, newspapers, as well as movies and radio addresses, to gain support for popular initiatives. Hoover would be the first administrator to proclaim Wheatless Wednesdays or Meatless Tuesdays as a way that people could voluntarily help support the troops in Europe. Americans grew victory gardens in backyards and vacant lots. But the Food Administration would fix prices on wheat, pork, and other agricultural goods at a high rate as a way to encourage Americans to consume less. Government agencies under Wilson never had more than feeble formal powers and were disbanded within days of the armistice in November of 1918. Their aims to control raw materials, production, prices, and labor were temporary. However, they set a major precedent for future government-industry cooperation in the 1920s and following the Great Depression through Rooseveltian New Deal agencies of the 1930s. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of government-initiated restrictions and the self-denial of Americans during wartime was the creation of the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. Throughout the war, Congress had severely restricted the use of foodstuffs, grain, for manufacturing alcoholic beverages. Coupled with the political activity of the women's Christian temperance movement, as well as anti-German sentiment, the war effort was the final nail in the coffin for those that enjoyed consuming alcoholic beverages, at least temporarily. Though the war was over by the time the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919, the prohibition of the sale, the transportation, the manufacturing, and consumption of alcohol seemed to bring all three previous movements, prohibition, nativist, and patriotic duty, together in one instance. For the next 14 years, America would be a dry nation. President Wilson would also use a similar combination of volunteerism and government control to try to organize America's labor force. World War I was a tenuous time for America's laborers. European demand for American goods had helped double labor wages between 1914 and 1918. However, shortages, restrictions on goods, as well as rising prices had caused massive inflation above and beyond what wages were covering. Despite popular propaganda campaigns like "Labor will win the war," over 6,000 strikes occurred in American factories during the wartime, many of these led by the International Workers of the World Union, or IWW. Members of the IWW, or the Wobblies, had been responsible for high-profile anti-war protests as well as labor disputes, and even a few high-profile acts of sabotage against American industries that hampered our war production effort. Many of the IWW members were transient laborers in fruit and lumber industries and were victims of the worst kinds of working conditions in our country. But the arrest of Wobblies and their protests, which led their group to be dubbed as the I Won't Work Union, became increasingly anti-patriotic and antagonistic to the war effort. In 1918, the Wilson administration created the National War Labor Board to oversee labor disputes. Wilson appointed former President William Howard Taft as the co-chairman and established a court of labor disputes that presided over thousands of cases. The War Labor Board essentially prohibited strikes but encouraged progressive reforms like higher wages, a national 8-hour working day, and the right to unionization. These were significant recognitions of workers' rights and revolutionized labor relations. Labor leader Samuel Gompers supported the creation of the War Labor Board and led popular initiatives to support the war movement in general. Gompers and the AFL, American Federation of Labor, promised to prevent strikes during the war. While membership to the Wobblies diminished, AFL membership skyrocketed from 2.5 million members in 1916 to over 4 million by 1919. But the actions of a few radicals had consequences for the many mainstream laborers in the labor movement. Americans increasingly grew to view socialism and the actions of labor movements as one and the same. The power and influence of the War Labor Board is evident in the episode of labor disputes that followed the end of World War I. Just as the War Industries Board had dissolved, so too did the War Labor Board. In 1919, America faced its largest labor dispute in history. The steel strike of 1919, when 250,000 American amalgamated iron, steel, and tin workers walked off the job. Without the War Labor Board to negotiate this dispute, management refused to meet the terms of the AA. Where labor disputes during the war had been settled peacefully, this particular episode ended with the death of over 24 workers and their replacement by tens of thousands of African Americans drawn to the North for war industry employment during the Great Migration. The consequences of the 1919 steel strike reverberate even further. Tensions between white and black communities in urban centers exploded, especially in Chicago. Following an incident in July of 1919, where an African American youth was beaten to death by white Chicagoans, angry that he had used a whites-only beach. In the melee, 15 whites and 23 blacks were killed during a 2-week reign of terror. Tension between white and black communities, especially in urban centers, would continue to grow in the decades following World War I. The labor contributions of minority groups would indeed win the war. The War Department's special rule of work or fight, issued in 1918, required all able-bodied men to either maintain regular employment in a useful occupation or to enlist in the military. This created a labor shortage. Answering the call were thousands of African Americans from the South who had migrated during the Great Migration. W.E.B. Du Bois supported the war effort as a victory that would improve life for blacks and democracy. Mexican American workers also replaced workers who were on the front line. But perhaps the most significant contribution by a minority group to the war effort came from the over 1 million women who shifted their responsibilities from the home to the nation's industry. Many women workers aimed to improve the status of their family, as their husbands' wages were either lost or reduced because of the war, or out of a sense of patriotic duty. The women's suffrage movement was deeply impacted by World War I. The war itself split the women's movement into 2 camps. As we've discussed before, many progressive era feminists were identified as pacifists. This radical progressive fringe found a voice in the National Women's Party, created and led by Quaker activist Alice Paul, while mainstream suffragettes viewed it as their patriotic responsibility to support the president and the war. The National Women's Party demonstrated against the government and its hypocrisy in supporting democracy abroad while maintaining women as second-class citizens at home. The NWP initiated the longest-standing picket of the White House to that point in history. Bearing signs like "Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye." These women were arrested and sent to jail for trivial crimes like obstructing traffic. But to further demonstrate how women did not have a voice in American government, Paul led imprisoned women suffragettes on a hunger strike. If you ever get a chance, watch the movie Iron-Jawed Angels about the life and times of Alice Paul. You won't be disappointed. The larger majority of women's suffrage activists participated in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. These women supported the war effort and the president, and were led by feminist activist Carrie Chapman Catt. NASA maintained that suffragettes must take part in the war effort to earn a role in shaping peace, and that the best way to fight for democracy at home was to participate in the fight for democracy abroad. Though President Wilson had punted the women's suffrage issue down the road throughout the war, as the war came to a close, it was undeniable the role and impact women had had in American and Allied victory. By 1918, Wilson was vocally endorsing a suffrage amendment as a vital necessity to the war measure. A dozen states adopted women's suffrage on the local level, and the whole country followed with the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. 70 years after the first call for suffrage at Seneca Falls Convention, American women, regardless of race, now had the right to vote. But the economic and social gains of women attributed to World War I were not maintained over the long term. Following the end of the war, most women returned back to the home. By 1920, fewer women were working for wages than had been working in 1910. The perspective that men and women operated in two distinct social spheres had not been broken. But before leaving office, Wilson established the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor, created to protect women in the workplace. The Wilson administration did not only take unprecedented levels of control over the wartime economy and labor, it also exercised a greater amount of control over the personal freedoms of Americans and the press. The Wilson administration established the Committee on Public Information as a way to sell America on the war and sell the world on Wilson's war aims. Headed by George Creel, the CPI became known as the Creel Committee. Creel himself was a young journalist who believed that success in World War I depended on a finely crafted message supporting the president and his war aims. Creel imposed a voluntary censorship of the press. Messages that threatened to upend the war effort were either placed deep within news presses' papers or stricken altogether. For example, the message about the influenza outbreak of 1918 was publicized as the Spanish flu. Despite the fact that the outbreak had taken place in Kansas, the only international press agency that was publishing information about the flu outbreak were those out of Spain. Hence, the Spanish flu was sold as something that was remote and of little interest or consequence to Americans. Creel hired 75,000 4-minute men, or propagandists, to deliver speeches. Creel's payroll included the names of high-profile movie stars. Propaganda included posters, leaflets, and pamphlets, as well as anti-German movies like Hammer the Hun. Creel typified the American war mobilization effort, which relied more on aroused passion and voluntary compliance than on formal laws. He encouraged Americans to set up Liberty Leagues in every community and urged members to spy on their neighbors, especially their neighbors with foreign names, and to report any suspicious words or actions to the Department of Justice. There were over 8 million German Americans, mostly within the Midwest. Hysterical hatred of Germans and all things Germanic swept the nation. Orchestras found it unsafe to present German composers like Wagner and Beethoven. German books were banned from public library shelves. German classes were canceled, and popular food items like sauerkraut and hamburgers were renamed. But the consequences of anti-German activity were not just the renaming of favorite food items to Liberty Cabbage and Liberty Steak. The government brought about the most ambitious campaign against civil liberties since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917, which provided fines and imprisonment for persons making false statements, aiding the enemy, inciting rebellion in the military, or obstructing draft recruitment. President Wilson had also wanted broad presidential censorship powers, but Congress had repealed this in a final revision of a bill. Instead, it opted for the passage of the Sedition Act of 1918, which forbade any criticism of the government, the flag, or the uniform, even if that criticism was insignificant, and it expanded the exclusion of mail deemed as dangerous to the war effort. 1,900 American citizens were prosecuted for anti-war and unpatriotic activity. A large percentage of the government's targets were anti-war socialists and members of the radical IWW. Former presidential hopeful and socialist leader Eugene Debs was convicted under the Espionage Act in 1918 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for delivering a speech at the Socialist Party convention critical of U.S. policy in entering the war and warning of the dangers of militarism. While Debs was eventually pardoned by President Warren G. Harding in 1921, he is one of the most famous victims of a government policy that provided a blank check to prosecuting any speech that was considered unpatriotic or anti-war. Even the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of these acts. In the landmark case Schenck versus United States, 1919, Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes stated that Congress could limit free speech when words represented a clear and present danger. For example, a person could not falsely cry fire in a crowded movie theater because their actions would lead to panic and possible injury. Holmes recognized the importance of protecting the principle of free thought. He carefully articulated that free thought was not just for those that we agree with, but also the freedom of thought for those we hate. Eventually, Schenck versus United States and the clear and present danger statute would become the most influential benchmark in freedom of speech. After the war, presidential pardons were freely granted. However, some victims stayed in jail till the 1930s. Wilson would stand by the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. While he was pressured to repeal the bills in 1920, he let them continue, largely due to a communist witch hunt of 1919 and 1920. Wilson could be considered one of the most nativist presidents in U.S. history. In our next lecture, we will look at America's war efforts in Europe itself, as well as examine how the post-war world order did not uphold Wilson's 14 points.